Okay, remember that feeling. You know that feeling of totally bombing a test question. And you're like, swear that wasn't even covered in class.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, me too. And it kind of got me thinking, what if there's a better way? What if there's a better way to figure out what we're actually learning? What if grades, like, aren't the whole story?
That's funny you mention that because your experience actually connects to a huge shift that's happening in higher education right now. We're moving beyond just grades and looking deeper into how students are actually learning.
And that's what we're diving into today. We're tackling assessing undergraduate learning in psychology. Now, I know what you might be thinking.
Yeah.
Assessment and psychology, those two things together don't exactly scream, exciting podcast episode, right?
Right, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
But stick with us. This isn't about dry textbook stuff, I promise.
No.
This is about uncovering these really practical insights that can change how we think about measuring learning. Like whether you're a student or a teacher or just someone who, loves to learn new things.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how this book tackles this like elephant in the room. Everyone's tired of hearing about assessment.
Right.
But the authors make a really compelling case for why it matters, especially now. There's all this pressure on universities to prove their worth, to show that students are actually gaining something valuable from all this.
Totally. And it's not even just about justifying those tuition costs either. It's about making sure that these courses and these programs are delivering what they promise. That students are developing the skills, the knowledge that they can use in the real world.
Right. It's like ordering a fancy coffee and getting lukewarm instant instead.
Right.
Like total letdown.
Yeah.
And that actually reminds me of a point the book made about how courses can kind of drift from their original goals. You'll have different sections of the same class, maybe with different professors, and the learning experience can be totally different.
Yeah.
Even though it's like the same class on paper.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting you say that because, and this might be surprising to some people, that the key to effective assessment actually starts with how professors work together.
Okay.
So it turns out that a unified team, kind of like a well-run sports team, all focused on this shared goal, that actually leads to much better learning outcomes for students.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and they actually call these groups instructional teams.
Yeah.
So instead of professors kind of operating in silos, doing their own thing, they're all on the same page about what students should be learning and why.
I like that. And that why often comes down to learning objectives, right?
Yeah.
And I love how the book calls out vague objectives.
Yes.
Because it's like trying to bake a cake with a recipe that just says, add some sugar, but doesn't say how much.
Exactly.
Like recipe for a disaster.
Yeah. And instructors get these really broad objectives like understand social problem solving, which sounds impressive on paper, but it doesn't actually tell you how to teach it or how to know if students are actually learning it.
Okay, so give us an example. How do you go from that vague idea of social problem solving to something actually measurable?
Well, they use this example in the book about understanding individual and group values in social problem solving.
Okay.
It sounds complicated,
Yeah.
right? But if you break it down, instructors could have students, let's say, analyze real-world case studies, maybe even design their own solutions to social problems that they see, or even, reflect on their own values and how those influence their approach to problem solving.
So it's like taking this abstract concept and making it real, something you can actually like see and assess.
Exactly.
But it's not just about professors deciding what's important to measure, right? We need to hear from students too.
100%. That's such a crucial point. Assessment isn't just about looking at these data points, It's about understanding the whole learning process from different angles. And a student's perspective is so valuable. Yeah, their feedback can help identify blind spots in teaching, highlight what's working well, and just give a much richer picture of what's happening in the classroom.
And I love that idea. The book actually mentioned a professor who asks students to define the learning objectives, but in their own words.
Whoa!
Which is really cool because it not only ensures that they understand what's expected, but it also gives the professor valuable feedback on how those objectives are actually being perceived.
Totally.
So it's like a two-way conversation instead of a one-way lecture.
Exactly. And that professor's approach highlights how important it is to use a mix of methods to really get a full picture of student learning. Think surveys, focus groups, or even casual conversations.
Right.
These can all reveal a lot about what's really going on.
But I think some people might worry that this whole instructional team approach could stifle creativity. Like everyone's forced to teach the same way.
Right. Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But collaboration doesn't have to mean conformity, right?
Right.
Think of it like a jazz band. Each musician has their own unique style and their own, like, flair, but they're all working together to create this cohesive sound.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're talking about with instructional teams. It's about leveraging those individual strengths while making sure everyone is on the same page about those key learning goals.
So we've got these instructional teams working together, clear learning objectives, and we're actually listening to students. Sounds great in theory, but let's be real, assessment can feel like a chore, can't it?
Yeah.
How do we keep it from becoming just another box to tick, another hoop to jump through?
Right.
The book actually uses this term assessment fatigue.
Yes. Yes.
Have you ever felt that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Assessment fatigue is a real thing. And I think it happens when, it's like you said, it feels disconnected from what's actually happening in the classroom.
Right.
And I think the book encourages us to kind of shift our mindset a bit. Instead of seeing assessment as this one-time task, we check it off the list, think of it as this ongoing cycle of reflection and improvement.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just a snapshot, it's like a continuous process.
Exactly.
And they talk about how these things called academic program reviews can sometimes be a good nudge, you know, for departments to take a step back and say, okay, are we actually assessing what we care about?
Yeah, how are we doing?
How are we doing this? Is this actually working? But even then, it's easy to get really in the weeds and lose sight of the bigger picture.
Totally.
So how do we make assessment more meaningful?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And less daunting at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the book I love how they emphasize focusing on these practical improvements and celebrating the successes along the way. Like not making it this big, scary thing, but actually like, okay, what's one thing we can improve? How can we get a little bit better at this? And then when we do, celebrate those wins, and they actually even talk about this idea of an assessment hero, which I kind of love.
Wait, an assessment hero? Hold on, I need to hear more about this. Who is this assessment hero?
So it sounds a little hokey,
Okay.
but they were talking about this one program review where one faculty member was very clearly the one who was like pushing for these really innovative and successful assessment things.
Wow.
And they were energized by it. They weren't like bogged down by it. They were like excited about using the data to actually make things better for students.
Well, okay, that is kind of inspiring, though. It shows that you don't have to dread assessment. It can be a source of positive change, right?
Totally.
But for those of us who are not like natural-born assessment heroes,
Right.
what are some common pitfalls that we should try to avoid?
Yes, good question. There are a few that they call out, even for well-meaning instructors. They fall into these traps.
Right.
One of the big ones is getting so caught up in covering all the material. It's almost like they use this analogy of a toolbox.
Yeah.
You're giving someone this toolbox full of all these shiny new tools, but you never actually teach them how to use them.
Right. So it's not enough to just know the names of all the tools. You have to actually be able to like build something with them.
Exactly. And then, another big one is relying on these really easy assessments that don't actually measure what we care about. Right. They give the example of multiple choice tests that really just assess memorization.
Right.
Not deeper understanding.
It's like, checking boxes.
Yeah.
Do you know this term? Yes or no?
Yeah.
So how do we avoid those traps, though? Like, I'm all for making things easier, but not if it means sacrificing actual learning.
Right. Well, one of the things that they talk about that completely, I think, changed how I think about measuring progress is this idea of formative assessment.
Yeah.
So instead of just grading at the end, formative assessment is about guiding that learning while it's happening.
Okay, I like that. So it's like giving students feedback along the way so they can like course correct.
Yeah.
Instead of like crashing and burning at the final exam.
Exactly. It's all about giving those opportunities to practice, to get feedback, to, really hone their skills before it's time for that big, summative assessment at the end, whether it's a final exam or a big project.
Right. And that actually reminds me of something else the book talks about, this idea of connecting assessment to the science of learning.
Yes. Love this.
Because, our brains aren't just these empty vessels, right? Just waiting to be filled with knowledge. there are actual ways that we learn best,
Yeah,
right?
and we should be using those, right? We should be
Yeah.
using that research to inform what we're doing.
Absolutely. And that's a key point that they make, that assessment should really be informed by the science, by how our brains actually learn. And they highlight strategies like retrieval practice. Have you heard of retrieval practice?
Yeah.
It's basically testing yourself on the material. And space learning, which is
Okay.
like spacing out your study sessions over time.
Right.
And these are proven techniques that boost retention.
Totally.
So instead of cramming all night before a test,
Which we've all done.
which we've all done, yes,
Yeah.
we should be encouraging students to, space out their studying, quiz themselves regularly,
Right.
really kind of like make it an active process.
Exactly. And imagine if our assessments were designed with those principles in mind.
Oh, that would be cool.
Right. Not just testing what they remember, but actually promoting that deeper learning through how we assess.
Oh, that's good. I like the assessment for learning.
Yes.
Rather than just assessment of learning.
Exactly.
But this is where it gets kind of meta, right?
Okay.
Because Chapter 8 introduces this concept of stealthy pedagogical science, which sounds very fancy.
Yeah.
But basically, it's using assessment data not just to evaluate students, but to actually improve our teaching and to even like advance our understanding of how people learn in general.
Exactly. And I love that they call it stealthy.
Right.
It's like we're getting away with something.
Yeah.
But it's like,
It's like a positive side effect.
it is. It is. This is where assessment becomes this incredibly powerful tool for growth. And it's on multiple levels,
Yeah.
right? It's not just about, okay, did they get this question right or wrong, but it's what can we learn from this?
Yeah.
What questions can we ask? How can we experiment? How can we get better?
And it's not like we have to choose, right, between teaching and research. They can work together, right?
They totally can.
Hand in hand.
And they should. And the book actually gives an example of a psychology professor who uses data from their intro psych course, a big lecture course.
Yeah.
Not only to, obviously teach the material, psychological concepts, but also to gather research insights.
Wow.
So it's like this feedback loop. Teaching informs the research informs the teaching, and it's all driven by this assessment data.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Formative assessment, the science of learning, this stealthy pedagogical science, which I love.
Right.
But the book doesn't stop there, right?
It doesn't.
It delves into even more, like evidence-based course
Yeah.
design
Yes.
and this idea of continuous improvement.
Yes. Love it.
So what's that all about?
So those chapters, they build on everything we've been talking about, and they're really encouraging educators to take this scientific mindset.
Okay.
When they're thinking about their course, when they're thinking about assessment, let's use data.
Yes.
Let's use data to actually inform the decisions we're making. Let's try new approaches.
Yeah.
Let's not be afraid to experiment a little bit.
Yeah. So it's like treating your course like an ongoing experiment. Right.
Exactly.
Always looking for ways to make it more effective for the students.
Yes.
But it's not just about tweaking your individual courses, right?
Right.
It's about scaling this up to the entire program, right?
Absolutely. And that's what they talk about, this idea that assessment shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be this separate thing. It needs to be embedded throughout the curriculum.
Yeah.
It's the thread that connects everything from the learning objectives you set at the beginning to the final course evaluations you get.
And speaking of a broader perspective, the book also touches on how other countries are tackling assessment, which is fascinating.
Oh, I love that.
Because it's like taking a peek into different classrooms around the world.
Yeah, and it's a great reminder that, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to assessment.
Right.
Different cultures, different educational systems, they're going to have different values, even different learning goals, and that's going to shape how they approach assessment.
Right, and they gave an example of this really interesting tool called the Cultural Controllability Scale.
Oh, interesting.
And it looks at how, people's beliefs about control
Oh, wow.
can actually affect how they approach learning.
Fast.
And then there's this other one that I thought was really cool called the value rubrics. Have you heard of those?
I haven't, no.
Yeah, they're these rubrics that are used to assess these more complex skills.
Oh, cool.
Like, critical thinking, communication, things that are, hard to measure.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to see how much innovation is happening in the field of assessment.
It really is, and I think it really highlights the importance of looking beyond, just what we're doing in our own classrooms.
Right.
What can we learn from each other? What are the successes? What are the challenges? How can we all get a little bit better at this?
It is. And it's funny because it reminds me of that saying, I don't know if you've ever heard this one, not everything that counts can be counted.
Mm,
And I think, so often in education, we focus on what's easy to measure,
right.
the test scores, the grades. But some of the most valuable things, things like curiosity, resilience, a love of learning, those are much harder to quantify.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are important. It's like trying to measure the impact of a single raindrop in a thunderstorm.
Right.
Like each one contributes to this larger whole, but how do you isolate that individual effect,
Yeah, that's
right?
right. Yeah, great.
So how do we even begin to assess these more intangible qualities, these things that we're talking about?
Yeah. I think it requires a real shift in perspective. Instead of just looking for those right or wrong answers, we need to create assessments that actually allow those qualities to surface. So think, open-ended projects, reflective writing assignments, peer feedback,
I like that.
things that give students a chance to show their thinking process,
Yeah.
how they're growing over time.
So almost like we need to become more comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah,
The idea that there isn't always one right answer,
exactly.
especially when you're talking about humans.
Especially with humans, yeah.
It's messy.
Yeah. And this is where I think things get really, really interesting. Because as we develop these more creative approaches, these more nuanced approaches to assessment, I think we're actually going to discover new things about how people learn. It
Yeah.
could lead to all these breakthroughs, not just in education, but beyond.
That's a really cool thought. I like that. Well, this book has given us so much to think about.
I know, right?
I mean, from the importance of, teamwork among professors to the power of formative assessment, this idea of stealthy pedagogical
I
science.
know, it's a lot.
There's a lot there. But I think the most exciting takeaway for me is that we're still figuring it all out, right?
Totally.
Like, there's so much room for innovation in assessment.
Absolutely. We're moving beyond these standardized tests and these checklists, right?
Right.
We're moving towards a more holistic, human-centered approach. And who knows what amazing tools and strategies are out there that we haven't even thought of yet.
Right. It's like we're entering this new era of assessment, right? One that's more focused on growth and discovery than just measuring what students already know.
Precisely. And I think that's a message worth sharing.
Yeah.
Assessment doesn't have to be this scary, high-stakes thing.
Right.
When we do it well, it's a powerful tool for learning and growth.
Yeah.
For students, for educators, for all of us.
Absolutely. So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into assessing undergraduate learning in psychology, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, a question to ponder. If you could design like the ultimate assessment, the one that truly captures what it means to be a lifelong learner, what would that look like?
Oh, wow. What a question. That's a good one. It really challenges us to think about, what's the purpose of education? What are those skills, those qualities that are going to help people thrive, not just in their careers, but in life?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's a big question.
And maybe, just maybe, by asking those big questions, by pushing the boundaries of what we think assessment can be, that's how we unlock new possibilities.
I love that.
Not just for learning, but for human potential, really.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.